I still remember the way my mother's voice trembled that night. The way my sister looked at me, her eyes pleading, desperate. I told them no. I told them this was insane. But they wouldn't stop. They wouldn't let it go. And then I gave in. If I had just walked away, if I had just left the room, none of this would have happened. But I didn't. And now, I have to live with what I did. They say some moments haunt you forever. Some decisions change everything, and no matter how much time passes, you can never go back. It's been 3 years since that night, 3 years since I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross. I had always seen myself as a good person. Someone with morals, self-control. Someone who knew the difference between right and wrong. But I've learned something about life. When you're pushed to a breaking point, when loneliness digs into your skin so deep you can barely breathe, when the people closest to you look you in the eye and beg you to give them what they want. Sometimes, the lines blur. Sometimes, you don't recognize yourself until it's too late. Before I share my story, don't forget to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga now for more true, mind-blowing confessions. And tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a temptation so strong, so impossible to resist, that it changed everything? If you asked anyone who knew me back then, they would have told you I was a good husband. A good brother. A good son. They would have said I was reliable. Responsible. The kind of man who puts family first. And I did. I always did. But what they wouldn't have seen, what I never let anyone see, was the loneliness. The kind of loneliness that doesn't just sit beside you, it lives inside you. It settles in your bones. It follows you from room to room, like a shadow you can't shake. My wife and I, we weren't the same anymore. We used to be in love. At least, I think we were. It's hard to remember now. Somewhere along the way, things just faded. We still lived under the same roof. We still spoke. But the conversations were short. Hollow. Like two strangers passing each other in a hallway. She was always busy. Work. Friends. Her own world that didn't seem to include me anymore. And I stopped trying. I told myself it was normal. That this is what happens in marriage, after enough time. The passion disappears. The warmth fades. You become more like roommates than lovers. But that emptiness, it started to eat at me. And I don't know when it happened, but I stopped feeling like a husband. I stopped feeling like a man. And that's when they came to me. My mother. My sister. Both of them, broken in their own way. Both of them needing something. And for the first time in a long time, someone needed me. My mother was always a strong woman. She raised us on her own for most of our childhood. My father left when we were young, ran off with someone younger, someone new. And maybe that's where it started. That fear of being abandoned. That need to hold on to something, anything, that made her feel secure. She never showed weakness, not to the world. But I saw it. The way her hands trembled sometimes when she thought no one was watching. The way she held on to people too tightly, afraid they'd slip away just like my father did. And then there was my sister. The golden child. The one who was supposed to get it right. The one who was supposed to have the perfect life, the perfect marriage. But life doesn't always work out the way we think it will. Her husband, he was worse than mine. Cold. Controlling. The kind of man who made you feel like a prisoner in your own home. She used to call me late at night, whispering so he wouldn't hear. Telling me she felt trapped. That she felt like she was disappearing. I should have seen it then. I should have realized what she was looking for. What they were both looking for. It was supposed to be just a family trip. A weekend away. A cabin in the woods. quiet. Secluded. Just the three of us. My wife had an excuse, she always did. Work. A last-minute meeting. A reason to stay behind. And for the first time in a long time, I was alone with them. Just the three of us. It felt normal, at first. We laughed. Cooked together. Drank wine by the fireplace. But there was something in the air. Something I couldn't name. The way my mother looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. The way my sister touched my arm just a little too long. The way the wine loosened our tongues, made us say things we never would have said otherwise. Looking back, maybe I should have noticed. The way my mother's voice trembled when she spoke. The way my sister's eyes lingered on me, just a second too long. The way the silence stretched between us, heavy, charged, waiting for something to break it. Maybe I should have seen it then. Maybe I should have stopped it before it started. But I didn't. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late. There are moments in life where you stand at a crossroads. Moments where you know, deep in your gut, that if you take one more step, you can never go back. I had that moment. That split second where I could have made a different choice. I could have walked away. But I didn't. And that night, everything changed. It started with the wine. That's what I tell myself, anyway. Maybe if we hadn't had that second bottle, maybe if we'd stopped at just one, things wouldn't have spiraled the way they did. But we didn't stop. We kept pouring. Kept drinking. And little by little, the air around us changed. It was supposed to be a celebration. A toast to family. To being together. But as the glasses emptied, so did the space between us. The laughter got quieter. The conversations got deeper. And before I knew it, we weren't talking about family anymore. I remember my mother sitting across from me, the firelight catching the glass in her hand, her fingers wrapped around the stem so tightly I thought it might shatter. She looked at me, not just like a mother looks at her son. Like a woman looks at a man. And then my sister spoke. She was sitting beside me, closer than she should have been. I could feel the warmth of her body against mine, the way her breath hitched just slightly before she said it. Do you ever feel like no one really sees you? It was an innocent question. At least, it should have been. But there was something behind it. Something raw. Something that made my stomach tighten. I didn't answer right away. I don't know if I even could. Because the truth was, she was right. I did feel invisible. I had for years. My mother placed her glass down carefully, fingers tracing the rim. Her voice was softer when she spoke next, but there was an urgency beneath it. You give and give, but what do you get in return? I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I didn't want to have this conversation. Not with them. Not here. But it was too late. The words were already in the air, floating between us, settling into the spaces we had spent our whole lives pretending didn't exist. At some point, my sister's hand found mine. I don't know how it happened. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Or maybe it was just inevitable. Her fingers curled around mine, soft. Warm. And I didn't pull away. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up. I should have walked out of that room and never looked back. But I didn't. And then my mother said something that made my blood turn cold. You don't have to be alone anymore. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at her. At my sister. And my sister was looking at me. There was no mistaking what they meant. No mistaking what they were asking. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were trembling. My mind screaming at me to stop this before it went any further. But then my sister whispered it, soft, so soft I almost didn't hear it. We just want to feel loved, is that so wrong? And just like that, everything inside me shattered. I told myself I'd never cross the line. But then, they said something that shattered my resolve. And that's when I knew. There was no turning back. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I told myself it was just the alcohol. That we had all had too much to drink, that the words spoken at the table weren't real. But I knew that was a lie. Because when I closed my eyes, all I could see was the way my sister looked at me. The way my mother's voice wrapped around me like a whisper I couldn't shake. We just want to feel loved, is that so wrong? I repeated it over and over in my mind, trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood. That they hadn't meant what I thought they had meant. But deep down, I knew. I had always known. I wasn't a bad person. I needed to believe that. But that night, lying in the dark, feeling the walls of the cabin closing in around me, I felt something inside me start to crack. I tried to push it away, tried to remind myself who I was, tried to hear my wife's voice in my head, though it had been so long since I had heard it with warmth. But all I could hear was my sister's whisper. All I could see was the way my mother looked at me, like I was the answer to something she had been searching for her whole life. And for the first time in years, I felt needed. I felt wanted. And the worst part? I liked it. The next morning, I told myself I would act normal. That I would shake off the night before and pretend it never happened. But when I walked into the kitchen, my sister was already there. She didn't say anything at first. Just stood by the counter, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at me like she was waiting for something. I could feel it in the air, something unspoken stretching between us. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but then she smiled. And for some reason, my stomach twisted. Not in fear. Not in disgust. But in something else entirely. Something I didn't want to name. That day, we talked more than we had in years. About things we never should have talked about. Regrets. What ifs. The feeling of waking up next to someone who didn't see you anymore. She told me how trapped she felt. I told her I felt the same. And when our mother walked in, she didn't interrupt. She just sat down with us. And the three of us sat there, in that cabin, in that silence. All of us knowing what was happening. All of us pretending we didn't. It started small. A hand on my shoulder that lingered too long. A laugh that felt too familiar. An embrace that wasn't just an embrace. It was my mother brushing a piece of hair from my forehead, her fingers lingering against my skin. It was my sister resting her head against my shoulder, sighing like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. I told myself nothing had happened. That I had done nothing wrong. But that night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above my bed, replaying every touch, every look, every word spoken in whispers. And the worst part? I wasn't just afraid of what I had done. I was afraid of what I wanted to do. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. And that scared me more than anything. I knew it was wrong. But the way they looked at me. The way they begged. How could I say no? And then, that night. Everything spiraled out of control. That night, something shifted. I could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on all of us. No one spoke about what was happening. No one dared to put words to it. But the silence was saying everything. We were walking on a razor's edge, all of us pretending we weren't looking down at the fall beneath us. But deep down, I think we all knew. We had already started slipping. It happened in the quiet. Not in a dramatic moment. Not in some grand, reckless act. But in something smaller. Something inevitable. I don't even know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was my mother, watching, waiting, expecting. But at some point, that night, my sister and I found ourselves alone. The wine had been flowing all evening. Our mother had gone to bed, or at least, that's what we told ourselves. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing red in the dim light. And the only sound was the quiet rhythm of our breathing. I should have left. I should have walked upstairs and shut the door and forced myself to sleep. But instead, I stayed. She looked at me like she was searching for something. Something I wasn't sure I wanted to give her. Something I wasn't sure I could give her. But then she spoke. Soft. Hesitant. We shouldn't be doing this. Her voice was trembling. But she didn't pull away. And neither did I. It wasn't just about desire. It was about something deeper. Something more dangerous. It was about need. I needed to be wanted. To be seen. She needed to feel something, anything, other than the suffocating emptiness she had been drowning in for years. We were two people starving for something we couldn't name. And in that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But the guilt was there too. It sat between us like an unwelcome guest. The voice in my head was screaming, begging me to stop. To pull away. To remind myself that this was wrong. But another voice, one that had been buried deep for years, whispered something else. It told me that this was inevitable. That it had always been leading to this moment. And I didn't know which voice to listen to anymore. The next morning, everything should have felt different. But it didn't. Not at first. We acted normal. Or at least, we tried to. But the way she looked at me across the kitchen table. The way our mother watched us a little too closely, like she could feel the change in the air. I knew we were already slipping. And the worst part? Some small, reckless part of me didn't want to stop. There was a thrill to it. A dangerous, intoxicating thrill. The secrecy. The stolen glances. The knowledge that we were walking a tightrope, that we could fall at any moment. It made my heart pound. It made my skin burn. But beneath the thrill, was the fear. The fear that someone would see. That someone would know. And worse. The fear that I wouldn't care. It wasn't just between us anymore. People started to notice. The way we stood too close. The way our conversations carried something unspoken beneath the words. The way my mother would watch us with that knowing look, like she had seen this before. Like she had been waiting for it. And then, we slipped. It was a mistake. A moment of carelessness. A touch that lasted too long. A glance that lingered when it shouldn't have. A slip-up. And suddenly, we weren't the only ones who knew anymore. I thought we had control. I thought we could keep it between us. I thought we could stop whenever we wanted to. But then, my sister said something that changed everything. Something that made my blood run cold. Something that made me realize. There was no going back. There comes a moment. A moment where you realize you've gone too far. That no matter what you do, no matter how much you tell yourself you can stop, you won't. I had been telling myself for days, maybe even weeks, that I had control. That this was something we could keep contained. That as long as no one knew, as long as no one said it out loud. It wasn't real. But then, she said it. My sister. She looked at me, her voice quiet, trembling. But there was something else in her eyes, something dangerous. And she said, "You don't have to go back." For simple words. For words that turned my blood to ice. I tried to laugh. To brush it off. But she wasn't smiling. She wasn't joking. Her hands were gripping the fabric of my shirt, knuckles white. "Stay," she whispered. "With us. With me." And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was something else. Something I didn't have the strength to walk away from. Or maybe I didn't want to walk away. We didn't hear the footsteps. Or maybe we did, but we ignored them. Maybe we were so wrapped up in our own world, our own delusion, that we didn't realize we weren't alone. Until it was too late. Until my mother's voice cut through the air like a blade. "So, you've made your choice." I turned, my heart slamming against my ribs. She was standing in the doorway. Watching. Waiting. And the look in her eyes. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even anger. It was something else. Something worse. I expected her to scream. To accuse us. To stop us. But she didn't. She just stood there. Watching. And then she whispered. It was supposed to be me. The room tilted. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I thought I had misheard her. But then she said it again. It was supposed to be me, not her. And that's when I realized. She had been waiting for something too. The weight of what she had just said. It crashed down on me like a wave, drowning me in something I didn't understand. Or maybe I did understand. Maybe I had understood from the very beginning. And maybe that was the worst part. Because when she stepped forward, when she reached out, when her fingers trembled against my face, I didn't pull away. I should have. I should have run. I should have burned that cabin to the ground before I let this happen. But I didn't. And that night, everything fell apart. I had done something unforgivable. I knew it. I could feel it in the way the air had changed. In the way my sister wouldn't meet my eyes. In the way my mother stood there, silent, watching, like she had won. I should have felt regret. I should have felt horror. But the worst part? The part that still keeps me up at night? I didn't. Not yet. I thought that was the worst of it. I thought that was the moment that would destroy me. But I was wrong. Because the real nightmare was just beginning. I thought I could handle it. I thought we could keep it between us. That if we just acted normal, if we just carried on like nothing had happened, it would fade. Disappear. But secrets like this don't disappear. They fester. They grow. And no matter how hard you try to bury them, they always find a way to the surface. The next morning, everything felt off. The air in the cabin was different. Thicker. Heavier. Like the walls had soaked up what we had done, and now they were pressing it back onto us. We didn't speak about it. Not directly. But I could feel it in the way my sister wouldn't meet my eyes. In the way my mother hovered a little too close, watching. Always watching. I told myself it was just in my head. That I was imagining it. But then, the mistakes started happening. It was little things at first. The way my sister's hand brushed against mine at the breakfast table and lingered for just a second too long. The way my mother spoke to me in a tone that was different now. Something almost possessive. The way I flinched when my wife called me, as if she could somehow hear the guilt in my silence. I told myself no one noticed. That no one could possibly put the pieces together. But then, the first crack appeared. It happened over dinner. A simple conversation. My mother, my sister, and I, sitting at the table. And my mother, calm, casual, looked between the two of us and said, "You two have been awfully close lately." The room went still. My sister's fork clattered against her plate. My pulse pounded in my ears. I forced a laugh. Forced myself to say something, anything to make it sound like a joke. But my sister. She said nothing. And my mother just smiled. Like she knew. That was the moment I knew, this wasn't something we could just forget. Because we weren't just keeping a secret. We were living it. And it was only a matter of time before it destroyed everything else. My wife noticed first. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it. The way I was distracted. The way I hesitated before answering her. The way my phone sat in my hand just a little too long before I replied to a message I shouldn't have been getting in the first place. One night, she asked me outright. "Is there someone else?" And for a second, a brief, terrible second, I almost told her. Not because I wanted to confess. But because I wanted out. My mother, though. She wasn't afraid. She didn't act like someone who had something to lose. If anything, she acted like she had won. She watched me carefully. Every word. Every movement. Like she was waiting. Like she was testing me. And then, one night, she said something I still hear in my head, over and over again. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper, and said, "You're one of us now. There's no going back." And the terrifying thing? A part of me believed her. I wasn't myself anymore. I had become something else. Something I didn't recognize. The guilt should have been crushing. It should have broken me. But it didn't. Because at the heart of it, buried beneath the shame. I didn't want to stop. And I think they knew it. I think that's why they never asked me to. I thought we had control. I thought we could keep this contained. I thought we were careful. But then. Someone found out. How did it come to this? I ask myself that question every day. How did I become this person? How did I let it get this far? I used to think I was good. That I had principles. Morals. That I knew the difference between right and wrong. But now, I don't know what I am anymore. There are nights I wake up, gasping for air, drowning in regret. I see my wife's face in my dreams. The way she looked at me before she knew, before suspicion started creeping into her eyes like a slow, deadly poison. I see my sister's hands, trembling as she reached for me, as if I was the only thing in the world that could save her. I see my mother's smile, knowing, satisfied, like she had seen all of this coming before I ever did. And worst of all, I miss it. I still dream about them. I still wake up craving what we had. Was it worth it? I've asked myself that question 1,000 times. And I wish I could say no. I wish I could tell you that I would take it all back if I had the chance. That if I could go back to that first night in the cabin, if I could undo every whispered word, every stolen glance, every moment we let the lines blur. I would. But the truth? The truth is, I don't know. Because what we had, it was wrong, it was sick, it was forbidden. But it was also the most alive I've ever felt. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. The fact that if I had the chance to do it all over again, I don't know if I would stop myself. I've thought about confessing. I've thought about sitting my wife down, looking her in the eye, and telling her everything. I've thought about watching her face twist with disgust, with heartbreak, with hatred. I wonder what she would do. Would she scream? Cry? Would she walk away, or would she stay just long enough to make me suffer? But then there's the other part of me. The part that whispers, keep it buried. The part that tells me there's no reason to burn what's left of my life to the ground. The part that says, no one ever has to know. And maybe that's true. Maybe I can live with this secret. Maybe I can carry it to my grave. But then, the phone rang. It was late. My wife was already asleep beside me, her breath slow, steady, trusting. I almost didn't answer. I should have ignored it. But something told me to pick up. And when I did, her voice came through the line. Not my sister. Not my mother. Someone else. Someone who knew. And just when I thought it was over, I realized it was only the beginning. I don't know how this ends. I don't know if I'll keep running from it. Or if one day, the weight of this secret will crush me. But I do know one thing, I can't be the only one. I can't be the only person who's ever stood at the edge of something forbidden and stepped over it anyway. So tell me. What would you have done? If you had been in my place, trapped between guilt and desire, between loyalty and temptation, would you have walked away? Or would you have done what I did? I read every comment. Every story. Every confession. Talk to me. Because maybe, just maybe, I'm not alone in this. If you want more stories like this, more truths that people don't dare to speak out loud, like, comment, subscribe. This is Shocking Infidelity Saga. And I have so much more to tell you. Loneliness makes you do things you never imagined. It takes the parts of you that you thought were unshakable, and it breaks them apart. It whispers in your ear, telling you that the rules don't apply anymore. That just one moment, one touch, one decision, won't change everything. But that's a lie. Because some mistakes, you can never take back. Be careful what you give in to. Because some temptations cost everything.